Hello, my name is Jefferson Nunn, and it's astounding, absolutely astounding, all that is going on with COVID over the last 6, 7 months that I've been following this. I first learned about it toward the end of the year, January. I remember reading some early news out of China about a potential bird flu. And the more I read, the more concerned I got because it didn't seem that it was really under control. Um, and as we all know from the last round of bird flu, ended up spreading around the world, and even that one was less bad than this one. And even the origins of the bird flu or the current virus, COVID, seems to be, disputed. As much research as we can do, it seems to be limited to perhaps a lab in China, potentially, most likely from a market in China. The origins, however, are not disputed. It definitely originated in Wuhan, China. This is definitely not disputed at all. And so, before we get into all of this, it's going to be helpful to even start with what I like to call a frame of reference. Let's start with, why should anybody listen to me? I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a virus expert. I'm not even really a full-fledged economist. So what am I? Well, I'm somebody that is at heart an engineer. I like to engineer solutions, and as such, I like to read. I've read, probably over the course of my life, tens of thousands of books. I've read a lot on the internet. And one of the things that I've done is I really like to understand the origins of things. There's a great documentary series called Connections by James Burke. And I would highly recommend anybody that is interested in the field of science to study that Connections series. Because he really traces the origins of ideas, of thoughts, of how we determine our reality. Sometimes I wonder, if we really chose things, like, why I would even choose this plane of existence, right? Because there are a lot of really odd things that go on here. But one thing I know we can agree on is how we determine things to be true. Let's start with that. How can we determine what is real and what is fake? To start with, let's use a simple example. And this goes under frame of reference. We have to have a common frame of reference in order to have a proper communication about what something is. So, gravity, right? I think we can all agree that gravity is real. Even flat earthers would agree that gravity is real. And by gravity, I mean this idea that if we drop something and we have some way of measuring it, it's going to fall at an established rate of speed. We can even start with just dropping something, and we can all agree that when you drop something, when you have an object and you let go, it's going to go, well, in a direction. And I think we can all agree that that direction is down. If you decide that that direction is up, fine. Let's all agree that that direction is up. And that word up will translate into our perception that the object traveled in a particular direction that we all just agreed is up. And if you decide to argue that point, you just don't belong in this conversation. So now we can then take various measuring implements. I happen to have an American measuring implement. If you have a metric measuring implement, we can use that to determine between that and a stopwatch or some time measurement device, we can then determine the rate at which an object travels through this realm, which we happen to, I think, call Earth. So if you hear all my hesitations all throughout, you can understand my frustrations. And I think we can all agree that these frustrations end up being unwarranted. Do we really need to be frustrated over the concept of even gravity? It seems today that everybody wants to argue over every single iota of an event. And one would start to question why that would be. So I'd like to take you back to 2016, the last election. Actually, just before that, 2015. During that time, there was a factory, if you will, that was established in Russia. And it's actually relatively common knowledge that this so-called factory was established in Russia. And it was actually under Putin's organization, if you will, that this factory was established. And they hired potentially upwards of 10,000 people or more with overall a relatively low cost. And they actually started to greatly influence the US elections. And none of this is disputed, by the way. The evidence is clear. It has been presented in front of Congress. In fact, it was presented in front of a Republican Congress that the elections were influenced greatly through social media by Russian foreign operatives. And that is to say that they utilize hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of puppet accounts. We really don't know the full scope because a lot of the activity was hidden from our view. But there were tens of thousands of social media accounts that were commandeered, that they did the usual viral networking. They would post up meme after meme after meme, or post after post after post, in an effort to overwhelm the US population with the message that they control. Since 2016, it's not just the Russians that are doing this, but every foreign actor has taken over tens of thousands or more of social media accounts on Facebook, such that the message has been increasingly hard to even sometimes understand. And on top of that, it's not just foreign operatives that are doing this, but even just a common troll. Just a common troll. There's an organization that used to be called 4chan, but they since have reformed into several other splinter groups. And it seems that organization is comprised largely of rather odd individuals. Strangely, they're responsible for a lot of the memes that we know and have seen today. But these are people that I would argue are professional trolls. They go out of their way to craft the most bizarre message possible in an effort to get that message to the greatest number of people. And when it shows up on news or when it shows up in hundreds of places, they won. That's the world prior to today, prior to the release of the Wuhan virus, prior to the release of COVID. Now, before we get too much further into COVID, I'd like to establish, and everything I say is easily findable. After I post this, I'll have somebody transcribe it. I will post up every single reference for you to view under the video. Everything that I say is citable, it's provable. COVID is real. Let's start with that assertion. Just like we started off with gravity is real, let's start off with COVID is real. So, can we prove that COVID exists? How do we prove that COVID exists? Well, it's visible under a microscope. It's visible in the deaths of people that are dying in the hospital today. This very day, in cities like Houston, they are dying. It's provable that it is transmissible because a person can be shown to be prior a COVID infection and after a COVID infection. You can mark that event. Now, if you don't happen to like the name COVID, if you don't happen to like the name Wuhan virus, then you're more than welcome to use your own label for that event. I would be willing to concede the point that the label is not as important as the event. There is a demonstrable event where you can see somebody that didn't have this infection and they were exposed by somebody that did have this infection. They were standing around near or adjacent to a person that did have this infection. They were able to pick up this infection and become then subsequently infected. Now, this virus has been measured extensively by a number of virologists that independently throughout the world, and they have traced the mutation factor of this virus. And there's a website that you can go to where you can watch how this virus has mutated over time. This is a provable event. This is the same method that they use to measure influenza outbreaks, to measure other types of outbreaks. So this outbreak is very real. It is very deadly. to the certain population that gets it. Now, in America, this didn't start to get bad, really bad, until about February. How did this virus get bad in America? I can tell you. I can tell you exactly how this went down. So Wuhan and other cities near there, and I would argue that it's between the time frame of December and January, considering the 10 to 14 day lag from the time of infection to the time that it becomes virulent. It started to spread throughout China before anybody could lock down on it. Now, China lately, through the encouragement of Alibaba, has been a tech manufacturing hub. There is an event that many Chinese go to, that many Americans go to, that it's called CES in America. CES 2020 in January was where I believe that's the origins of the primary outbreak in America. China allowed their people to travel in an infected state. Travel further weakened their immune system. That led to more of a virulent outbreak all throughout CES. The people that were at CES traveled throughout other parts of the world. Those people subsequently traveled back to America or traveled to places like spring break in Florida, which led to a massive explosion in March. And that's the first signs of the outbreak in America. Now, I have not discussed any other aspect of how the virus is operating. I'm only discussing the early origins of the virus. And during this time, I penned an opinion article as well as several posts on Facebook and other places attempting to get people to become even aware of the severity of this virus. Now, it turns out the Trump administration during this time were also discussing a response to this virus, and they canned their response to this virus for reasons that I still to this day I'm not sure why. But there was a purchase order for millions of test kits. There was apparently documents drafted for a massive federal response, but none of this happened in March other than a not really strongly enforced shutdown. In China, they responded strongly to the virus. They began extensive contact tracing to the point that they were taking people off the streets. Literally, they would drive up to a person and take them off the street and put them in the back of a van and drive off somewhere. Well, they got their virus under control. In the United States, it appears that we value our freedoms more than we value life. That is an assertion I will grant you. that requires proper citation. So let's go through it. There is a corollary assertion from the opposing side that our freedoms are more valuable because the number of deaths from this virus is not great enough to warrant concern. That the death rate is actually lower than the death rates of many other things. And one of the things that they love to put out is a chart that shows, and you can find it on and the citation will be there on the website. I think it's One World Counter Stat Live, whatever. But there'll be a link under this. And so they go down the list, Worldometers info, that's the one. They go down the list of all the different death rates and the causes of deaths, right? And the largest causes of death globally, they argue, is abortion or infant death. Yes, I will concede that point, that is the largest cause of death. I will even concede the point that there are other causes of death currently higher than COVID. For example, death by heart disease, death by, what was the other one? Cancer, I believe, is up there. So I'll give you the actual numbers and the links to it. But currently, even without every other death rate, at 150,000 deaths so far this year, death by COVID is higher than any other death rate, including death by the flu. Now, one of the things that the people love to say is, the people that are saying that we don't need to wear a mask, that COVID is no big deal, that we just need to reopen the country, put our kids back into school, and just go about business as usual. One of the things that they do is to say that influenza overall has a lower death rate than COVID. No, it does not. And the stats are there to prove it. In the United States, for all of 2019, for the last flu season, between 24 and 62,000 people died from the flu. Even if you take the median, let's just call it a good 40,000, less people died from the flu during all of last year than have died from COVID between March and today. Something to think about. Next, the number of people. Here's something to think about. The number of people that die every day due to COVID. They go, oh, well, he had cancer and then the COVID got him. And so really he died of cancer, not COVID. Fine. Let's take a look at Herman Cain. I know this is a specific. I'm relating it to a generality. Therefore, it's not a logical assertion. It's not the point. I'm simply trying to reference or illustrate an example, and then we can go on to a larger generality and see if it holds true. Herman Cain, he is a cancer survivor. Survivor. That means doctors certified him as being free of cancer. He subsequently got COVID. You cannot argue that he died of cancer. However, you can argue that COVID weakened his immune system overall. And so as a result, he was less able to survive COVID. Next, Herman Cain probably got the best care possible. Still, he died. So it would not be a fair assertion to say that any cancer survivor died because of cancer because they got COVID and then died. If they got COVID and then died, they died because of COVID. They died because that virus attacked their immune system and was successful in the assault on their immune system, and therefore they died of COVID. So I would argue if they got a COVID test and they died because of COVID. Not because of cancer, not because of diabetes, not because of any of those other things. Yes, those other conditions were prevalent, but if they got COVID and they died because of COVID, if that COVID was not there, they would not have died. If Herman Cain did not get exposed to COVID, he would not have died. To take a look at this another way, if 150,000 people to date have died because of COVID, because they got the virus COVID and they died, 150,000 people got this, then what ultimately killed them? COVID. If COVID did not exist, then possibly they would have lived, correct? Let's take a look at the average death rate. If the average death rate of the entire population is, say, 7 out of 100,000, let's say, then only 15 of those people would have died if COVID did not exist. Because COVID was introduced to the world, an additional 150,000 people died on top of the people that have died from the last flu season. That is the logical point to concede. Anybody that says that compares COVID to the flu is trying to get you to think that COVID is like the flu. COVID is not like the flu. COVID is a standalone illness that deserves its own response, independent of any other response to any other illness. COVID is not the flu. COVID is an insidious virus. Let's discuss what COVID is and what it does. Again, every single thing I'm talking about is citable. It is from an authoritative source. COVID is a unique virus. This is why they call it novel, as in new, not as in a book. It is new. So COVID is a virus that attacks the blood vessel walls. This is so evil. So consider the things that are also attacking your blood vessel walls. Oh, diabetes causes inflammation throughout the body. Things that are also like that, or like heart disease. Those attack blood vessel walls, the plaque. And as a matter of fact, people that are older have weaker blood vessel walls. People that have diabetes have problems with their blood vessel walls. People that have heart disease have problems with their blood vessel walls. And they come to find out that those types of people are more likely to die from COVID. And there's a nasty little chart that they put out, by age group, who's more likely to die from COVID. If you are older, and you get COVID, you're up to 3 out of 10 of those people that get COVID that are 80 or older will die from COVID. Also, people that are between the ages of 0 and 6 stand a good percentage chance of dying from COVID. My children, my youngest, has a 1 in 100 chance of dying from COVID if he's exposed. And that's not something I like to roll the dice on. Now, again, everything I've said, and I'll say this 100 times to this video if I have to, is citable from an authoritative source. From the internet, there are people that are misunderstanding statistics. For example, 1,000 people, let me give you an exact number for yesterday, and I am going to share with you the exact site that I use so that we have a common frame of reference. This is COVID USA. And again, even this statistic has been altered by the CDC and the Trump administration. But that aside, let's use their number. People go, well, there's 67,000 deaths today. Oh, sorry, forgive me. There's 1,259 deaths today out of 67,023 newly confirmed cases. And they go, well, 1259 into 67023 says, it's only a 1.8% death rate. No. You have to consider the entire path of the virus. Herman Cain, for example. Again, I know specific generality, blah, blah. Herman Cain, they state he got the virus on June 30th. On that day, there were 41,200 new cases. He died 2 days ago. On that day, 2 days ago, July 30, there were 1,108 deaths. The death rate trails the new infection rate, which is why when they were reopening the economy and everybody had a massive party on July 4 saying that all is well, on that day, the day that they were saying all is well, there were only 591 deaths. I would argue that the death rate is not accurate. I only have a suspicion. This is not an assertion that I can approve. However, I will point to the fact that many of the hospitals are overwhelmed. Talk to any healthcare worker in an outbreak area, Florida, Texas, California. Talk to any healthcare worker Talk to a doctor there, talk to a nurse there, and they will say they're busier than they ever have been. Now, today, we have a few more weapons in our arsenal. I will not debate which weapons are used. We do have ventilators, we do have drugs. Whether or not they are successful or not, I'm not going to talk about it because I am not a doctor. But I am going to look at the numbers and I'm going to point out something. The death rate a month ago was lower than the death rate today. That is provable. Look at the trend line. We have more infections, we have a higher death rate. Now, I want to point out my boldest claim yet about this whole event. On 9/11, 2001, we know the exact number of people that died that day. 2,977 people died. 6,000 people were injured. Those numbers are not debatable. Every 2 days, approximately, we have an equivalent number of people that have died. We do not, to this day, know the injury rate. We do know that people that live and survive an infection by COVID and they live, they either possibly live with no symptoms or they may have lifelong symptoms. There are people that have survived and they have recounted their stories on Facebook saying that they have a decreased ability to function in life. They are saying they are injured. They're saying that they're unable to maintain employment due to their injury. And to this day, they're not able to get any assistance because this is so new. We haven't even modified any laws to grant them the assistance that they require due to this COVID injury. We can barely function in this new economy to even wrap our heads around this massive attack on our economy by this virus. We're still debating whether or not it's a Republican or Democratic plot, and I will assert, this is my boldest assertion yet, this is an attack on our species. This virus is attacking every human on this planet. Every human is at risk from this virus. Our way of life as a civilization and as a species is at risk from this virus. It does not matter if this is a Democratic or a Republican plot. Anybody that equates this virus to a political assertion is a flipping moron. They are using that to control or to influence or to get you to do something that you may not ordinarily do. This virus is insidious, and we do not yet know all the long-term consequences of being exposed to this virus. That is a true assertion because this virus has only been around since December. We know more about the influenza virus, and our species has become resilient against the influenza virus only because of evolution. This virus, COVID, is brand new. There are people that yet may die from this virus subsequent to the initial infection because of additional assaults on their immune system. COVID can render your immune system less able to fight things like diabetes and heart disease. Again, if you got COVID and you recover and you subsequently die of a heart attack, did you die because of a heart attack or because of COVID? If COVID did not exist in the first place, would you have died from that heart attack? These are questions that we're still going to be grappling the answers to over the next year. $150 people have died from the COVID virus, and we have not effectively mounted a response. 2,977 people died on 9/11, and we invaded 2 countries. We marshaled our military, went overseas, blew up a bunch of buildings and people, called it a success, kind of. We're still kind of there, by the way, in Afghanistan and Iraq. By the way, a lot of people have forgotten about that. We're still kind of there in those countries. We pulled out of Germany for reasons I can't fathom, but we're still there in Afghanistan and Iraq. 150,000 people have died from COVID. And we have not organized a global response to this crisis that could very well decimate our species. How, you may ask? Well, viruses tend to mutate. Just because the influenza virus hasn't yet mutated into something that's deadly to our species doesn't mean that it will. Just because COVID hasn't yet mutated into something that is now deadly to our entire species doesn't mean that it will or will not. I will concede both points. However, it is something that we should address with the seriousness that it will. If this virus had infected 5 million computers, would we have organized a more serious global response? If this virus had decimated 150,000 financial institution computers, like blew them up, would we have organized a global response? Computer viruses, this is an assertion, computer viruses are responded to with far greater intensity than this biological virus that could decimate our species. Even if it is not this virus, what about the next one? The time for debating is over. If we care to survive as a species, and I realize my message may fall on extremely deaf ears. I realize that maybe 5 people in my entire network, laughable network of 1,000 people on Facebook and who knows how many on LinkedIn that I'm going to share this out to, all of 5 subscribers on YouTube. But it is rather depressing to me to consider these points that I am making and that I am sharing with you, and that I will try to even publish as an ebook or whatever on Amazon, simply even as a record to say, hey, I was there when, and that I even predicted these events, just like I predicted that Trump may yet win the next election. Oddly, even though nobody likes him. His word, not mine. So, how do we go from here? How do we decide what is a proper response to this virus? We can't even get past the merits of a vaccine. Nobody deserves polio. There were people that had to live in these machines for their entire life. Otherwise, they would die. The iron lungs. And we don't have a better treatment than that today, by the way. If you get polio and it's bad, you're going in an iron lung. That's your life. I mean, this almost goes back to the philosophy of determinism. You know, it's like, that's a great show, by the way. The Good Place. You know, there's a guy that's a moral philosophy professor. Nobody likes moral philosophy professors, it's true. But, you know, he's standing there trying to figure out what he's going to do in life or whatever. And an air conditioner is about to fall on him. And a biker comes by. Spoiler alert, but biker comes by and he jumps back and the air conditioner falls down in front of him. And he stands for like 30 seconds, you know, shocked and stunned. And his friend goes, dude, are you okay? And then he comes back and he goes, hey, I know what I'm going to do in my life. You know, I figured it all out now. I finally have gotten it. Man, Freon's bad for the environment. I need to stay away from air conditioners. And dude's like, that's the lesson you got from this? COVID, I'm going to use the phrase aggressively. I know it's not technically correct, but COVID is murdering our species. 150,000 dead in America. And the lesson we're getting from it is Republican versus Democrat, anti-masker versus masker. Reopening schools or not. We're even debating the suicide rate. That's the lesson you get from this? No. Let's go back to the original. If COVID did not exist, if COVID never came into being, 150,000 people, plus or minus 15, would be alive today. COVID is a threat. COVID is a force to be reckoned with. If you can assign one property, this is Aristotelian logic, I will concede that point. But if you could assign one property, good or bad, to COVID, would you argue that COVID is a force for good, or is COVID a force for evil? If you assign the property that COVID is good, and that it's a good thing that 150,000 people are dead, then what is your benefit? Anybody that influences you to consider that COVID is a force for good, what is their benefit? What do they stand to gain from telling you that COVID is a good property, that you do not need to worry about COVID, that everything is fine, that if you get COVID, there's not going to be any problems in your life? What do they stand to gain by exposing you to that potential harm? If COVID is evil, and somebody says to you that that's the point, what do they stand to gain by that logical assertion? Do they stand to protect you from a potential harm? What is the benefit of avoiding that harm to society as large, to the species at large? Rather than debating how we can best manage the preservation of our species, those in power, media, the government, whoever you're listening to, whatever meme you're looking at, whatever statistic you're reading, those in power have chosen to debate the merits of the virus using Aristotelian logic, and have divided the population on that, have caused a great deal of harm, even to the economy, based on that, and have not, still to this day, taken the effects of this virus seriously. COVID could potentially be the first of many. Considering our response to this, I really wonder about our response to something that would be far more serious than this. And this doesn't even go to the economic debates that I have presented over the past few years through my book and through BTC Manager, wherein I am strongly debating the point of how the architecture of our economy is needlessly complex and, has a lot of problems, as is even evident in the current outbreak. Even that issue aside, I would encourage anybody to look to the source of who put out a message and what they stand to gain from that message. And I would encourage you to consider which label, if you had to assign one, good or bad, is this going to be a good thing for eliminating COVID, or is this going to be a bad thing and cause COVID to spread further? I would argue that even that rudimentary metric could be used to determine and to debase a lot of the messages that have been put out by those in power. And once you get past that, and then you get into how can we best preserve our species against an attack like COVID, is it better to be exposed to COVID in its raw form and to have your biological systems altered by it? Or is it better to be exposed to a weakened version of it or another version of it that triggers the same immune system response so that when you do get exposed to COVID, you stand a better chance? Or is it better to strengthen your natural immune system and to not take a vaccine, as it's called, so that you stand a better chance of surviving the natural occurrence of COVID, which we would normally never be exposed to, and then you can survive it? And consider that if you survive it, you will be living with the effects of that for the rest of your natural life, whatever those effects may be. Remember, we don't know everything about it yet. Those are just some very terrible, terrible questions to have to ponder. Yes, America could do a better job at strengthening our collective immune systems. We tend to eat a very terrible diet as a country. We tend to not do the right things in our lives. We expose our bodies to a variety of chemicals and bacterial infections and just random nasty stuff to our air, to our food, to our water. We have ripped up in the last 4 years a variety of regulations designed to make our collective immune system stronger. Those are all gone. Many factories are free to pollute the air, the water, even our foods. Even if we don't even argue that point, you can look to a variety of metrics. I'm happy to cite my sources that show that Americans are not in the healthiest possible shape right now for any kind of an outbreak. So a vaccine might be, if you were to assign a label, a potential shortcut to preserve a greater number of Americans that would ordinarily die if they're exposed to COVID. I suspect Trump has already got the vaccine. So what does all this mean? It means we're not treating this seriously. It means I have serious doubts about the next year of all of this. It means that we need to do a better job of understanding what is real and what is fake. It means that we need to consider that our species is at risk and that we need to come together in some collective fashion to properly respond to this, independent of us versus them. You know, if we can establish a global framework And we have established a global framework between all the antivirus researchers around the world. And we stop computer viruses and worms and Trojans every day. And there's a collective framework for that. Why don't we have one for biological viruses? I mean, let's say we don't like the World Health Organization for whatever random reason. Let's say that we, put somebody in charge of the CDC that said it's okay to go back to school because supposedly the risk would be minimal, which is scary to say the least. Let's say that all of that is true. Why isn't the CDC not orchestrating a global response to this pandemic? Why is the World Health Organization not architecting a global response to this pandemic and any future pandemic? We know more about our computer viruses right now than we know more about COVID. So I will leave you at this hour with those thoughts. And I would welcome any criticism of all the assertions that I have made. And I've only made a few. And I've only raised questions. Good day and good luck. And God bless.